I'm Tansy Sterling, 29, and I once held a doctorate in acoustic engineering from MIT before the crushing weight of medical bills for my dying mother forced me out of the laboratory and into the shadows of domestic service. The marble floor of the Thorne Estate foyer was cold enough to seep through the thin soles of my service shoes, sending a dull ache up my shins that settled deep in my bones. I adjusted the grip on my mop, my fingers red and raw from the harsh chemical lemon scent that seemed to permeate every inch of this 40-room mansion. To the world, I was invisible, just another uniform in a house that employed an army of them. To the IRS and the debt collectors calling my phone 10 times a day, I was a desperate woman drowning in 6 figures of hospital debt. But inside my head I was still Dr. Sterling, a woman who understood the physics of sound better than almost anyone on the East Coast. That knowledge was a curse in a house like this. The heavy oak front doors swung open, admitting a gust of autumn wind and the master of the house, Julian Thorne. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man carved out of granite and exhausted by the effort of holding himself together. He was 35. A tech mogul with a net worth that could buy small countries, yet he walked with the heavy tread of a man serving a life sentence. He didn't acknowledge me. I was furniture. I was part of the architecture, less interesting than the imported vase on the pedestal I was currently cleaning around. Where is he? Julian's voice was a baritone rumble, rich and commanding, the kind of voice that moved stock markets. Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper, scurried out from the hallway, wringing her hands. Master Leo is in the drawing room, sir. He's playing. Julian didn't thank her. He just strode past me, the air current from his expensive wool coat rustling the stray hairs escaping my messy bun. I shouldn't have followed. My job was to clean the foyer and then disappear into the laundry room. But my feet moved on their own, drawn by a curiosity that my degree had instilled in me, a need to solve problems that others deemed impossible. I hovered in the hallway shadows, clutching my mop like a shield, peering into the cavernous drawing room. 7-year-old Leo was sitting on the Persian rug, his back to the door. He was small for his age, with hair the same dark shade as his father's, but where Julian was rigid, Leo was a blur of motion. He was stacking wooden blocks, building a tower with obsessive precision. The silence in the room was heavy, almost suffocating. It was a silence I knew well. I had spent years studying the absence of sound, the way waves died against soundproofing foam. "Leo," Julian said. He spoke at a normal volume. The boy didn't flinch. He placed a blue block on top of a red one. Julian took a step closer, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood border of the room. "Leo, look at me." Nothing. Not a twitch. I watched Julian's face harden. It wasn't hatred I saw there. It was a profound, icy disappointment that was somehow worse. He walked around the boy, entering his line of sight. Leo looked up, his large, expressive eyes widening for a second. He reached up, holding out the blue block. Julian didn't take it. He just stared down at his son, his expression unreadable. "You don't even know I'm here until I'm standing on top of you," he muttered, the words more for himself than the boy. Leo lowered his hand, the light fading from his eyes. He sensed the rejection, even if he couldn't hear the tone. He went back to his blocks, retreating into his fortress of silence. "I spoke to the specialist in Zurich this morning," Julian said aloud, turning away from his son to pour a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. He was talking to the air, or perhaps to Mrs. Higgins, who was lurking nearby, but I heard every word. They said it's sensory neural. Complete degradation. There's no pathway for the sound to travel. He's a broken vessel. Broken vessel. The phrase hit me like a physical slap. My grip on the mop tightened so hard I thought the wood might snap. I felt the blood rushing to my face, a hot, prickly sensation of pure scientific indignation mixed with human rage. I looked at Leo again. I watched him carefully. As Julian slammed the heavy crystal stopper back into the decanter with a loud clink, Leo's left hand, which was resting flat on the floorboards, twitched. My heart hammered against my ribs. I saw it. I saw what the billionaire missed. Leo hadn't heard the clink, but the vibration of the heavy glass hitting glass had traveled through the sideboard, down the wooden legs, across the floor joists, and into the boy's palm. His brain had registered the disturbance. He wasn't broken. His inputs were just different. Julian took a sip of his scotch, grimacing. "Pay the nannies whatever they want," he said to the empty room. "Just keep him safe. Keep him occupied. There's no point in trying to fix what isn't there." He walked out of the room, passing within inches of me. He smelled of expensive scotch and despair. He truly believed his son was a lost cause, a defect in the Thorne legacy. I looked back at the boy. Leo had knocked his tower over. He was pressing his ear against the floorboards now, eyes closed, tapping the wood rhythmically with his fingernail. He wasn't playing. He was testing the resonance. He was doing exactly what I used to do in the anechoic chamber at the university. A fire lit in my chest, burning up the shame of my uniform and the fear of my debt. I wasn't just a maid. I was an acoustic engineer. And I knew with absolute terrified certainty that Julian Thorne was wrong. I couldn't just scrub floors anymore. Had to make some noise. I'm Tansy Sterling, 29, and I once held a doctorate in acoustic engineering from MIT before the crushing weight of medical bills for my dying mother forced me out of the laboratory and into the shadows of domestic service. The Thorne mansion felt less like a home and more like a cathedral of glass and steel, a cold monument where no one dared to speak above a terrified whisper. I stood in the hallway, pressing my body against the cool plaster, my duster forgotten in my trembling hand as the deafening tension of the house spiked into chaos. Down the corridor, the silence shattered. A crash echoed like a gunshot, the distinct, heartbreaking sound of ancient porcelain exploding against a hardwood floor. I flinched, my stomach dropping because I knew exactly who was responsible. Leo was screaming, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the sterile perfection of the hallway. I peeked around the corner and saw the small boy thrashing in the center of the foyer, surrounded by the jagged blue and white shards of a Ming vase that probably cost more than my entire life's earnings. His face was twisted in a rictus of pure agony, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks, but he wasn't looking at the broken pottery. He was clawing at his own head. Julian appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at his son like a king surveying a failed subject. He didn't rush down to check for blood or cuts. He didn't open his arms to soothe the hysterical child. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, his face a mask of exhausted irritation. He signaled to the two burly security guards standing by the entrance with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "Get him to his room," Julian commanded, his voice devoid of warmth, "and clean this mess up." The guards moved in, lifting the kicking, screaming 7-year-old off the floor as if he were a sack of unwanted laundry. Leo's hands were still clamped over his ears, his knuckles white, his mouth open in a silent plea that no one here knew how to translate. My heart thumped violently against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic and recognition. I wasn't looking at a spoiled brat throwing a tantrum. I was looking at a physiological emergency. My eyes locked onto the devices fitted snugly behind Leo's ears. They were sleek, state-of-the-art implants, the kind that cost a fortune and promised miracles. But as Leo thrashed, A tiny LED light on the left unit blinked a rapid, angry red. Froze. I knew that blink pattern. Back in the lab at MIT, during my dissertation on hyperacute auditory processing, I had studied specific neural feedback loops in children with sensory neural damage. I realized with a sick lurch in my gut that Leo wasn't acting out because he was naughty. He was in excruciating physical pain. The high-tech hearing aids Julian had forced on him weren't helping him hear. They were amplifying ambient static into a piercing high-frequency shriek that felt like a hot needle being driven directly into the auditory nerve. It was a rare condition, 1 in a million, a frequency sensitivity that turned standard amplification into torture. Leo wasn't breaking things because he was angry. He was breaking things because his head was on fire and he couldn't tell anyone to make it stop. I watched the guards drag him up the stairs, his silent screams echoing in the vast emptiness of the foyer. My breath caught in my throat, trapped by fear and a sudden, overwhelming, fierce protectiveness. Julian thought he was fixing his son, but he was inadvertently torturing him. I gripped the handle of my duster until my knuckles turned white. I held the key to ending that boy's suffering inside my brain, buried under layers of debt and servitude, and I knew in that moment that silence was no longer an option. I waited until the grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 2 a.m., the deep vibrations humming through the floorboards and into my mattress in the servants' wing. The mansion was finally a tomb, the oppressive silence settling over the stone and glass like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I slipped out of my narrow bed, my heart already doing double time against my ribs, and pulled on a dark hoodie over my pajamas to hide the trembling of my hands. I wasn't Tansy the maid right now. I was a thief in the night, stealing back my own potential from the wreckage of my past. I crept through the service entrance, wincing as the heavy oak door groaned on its hinges, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness. The night air hit me instantly, biting and damp, smelling of wet earth and the distant metallic tang of the city. I kept my head down, hugging the shadows of the manicured hedges, praying the security cameras were just sweeping the perimeter gates and not the employee parking lot. My rusted sedan sat alone in the far corner, a sad, oxidizing blemish amidst the fleet of polished black SUVs and vintage sports cars that belonged to Julian Thorne. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice on the asphalt before I managed to jam the jagged metal into the trunk lock. With a reluctant, rusty clunk, the lid popped open. The trunk light had burned out months ago, so I had to feel around in the dark, my fingers brushing against empty oil containers and a pile of old rags before hitting the cold, hard plastic of the Pelican case. I dragged it out, the weight of it straining my wrists. It was heavy not just with electronics, but with the crushing density of my failures. This case contained the ruins of my former life, the patents I lost, the research creditors seized, and the singular invention that had bankrupted me. I set the case on the gravel and clicked open the heavy latches. Asterisk snap. Snap. Asterisk. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay the Sync Vibe. I lifted it out, the charcoal-colored band cool and smooth against my skin. It didn't look like a medical miracle. To the untrained eye, it looked like a high-end pair of headphones or maybe a virtual reality accessory, unassuming and sleek. But as I ran my thumb over the copper conduction pads, I felt a familiar spark of electric excitement zap through my nervous system. This wasn't about amplifying sound waves. That was the mistake the other doctors were making with Leo. Their expensive implants were trying to force a damaged nerve to hear, like shouting at a man who had no tongue. The Sync Vibe didn't care about ears. It was designed to bypass the auditory canal entirely, translating sound frequencies into precise haptic neural impulses, vibrations that traveled through the skull and directly stimulated the brain's somatosensory cortex. It turned sound into touch, into a language the body could understand without ever needing to hear a single decibel. I held it up to the moonlight, watching the matte finish swallow the pale glow. I remembered the night I finished the prototype, the absolute euphoria of testing it on myself, plugging my ears and feeling a symphony play across my skull like a phantom orchestra. I had been so close to a breakthrough before the money ran out and the medical bills for my mother piled up like snowdrifts, burying my dreams under a mountain of debt. Now, holding it in the shadow of a billionaire's estate, the device felt radioactive. A wave of nausea rolled over me, sour and sharp. I knew the law. I knew exactly what happened to unlicensed practitioners who used non-FDA-approved experimental technology on minors. If Julian caught me strapping this to his son's head, I wouldn't just be fired. I would be arrested for assault, for practicing medicine without a license, for endangering a child. I could see the headlines clearly in my mind. Disgraced engineer harms billionaire heir. I would go to prison for years, and my mother, alone in her care facility, would be left to rot without me. I should put it back. I should close the case, lock the trunk, and go back to scrubbing toilets and keeping my head down. It was the safe choice. It was the sane choice. But then the image of Leo's face from earlier that day flashed behind my eyelids, searing itself into my conscience. I saw the raw, animalistic panic in his eyes as he clawed at his ears. I saw the silent scream that had shattered the vase. I saw a brilliant, trapped mind begging for a way out of the torture chamber. His own father was inadvertently building around him with his money and his ignorance. Julian saw a broken vessel. I saw a circuit that just needed to be rewired. I looked at the sink vibe in my hand, my grip tightening until the plastic bit into my palm. I wasn't just an engineer. I was a human being who had witnessed suffering that I had the power to stop. The risk was terrified, suffocating and real, but the alternative, letting that boy drown in static and silence, was a moral cowardice I couldn't live with. I slipped the headband under my hoodie, pressing it against my stomach to hide the bulge, feeling the cold metal warm against my skin. I closed the trunk with a soft click, the sound swallowed by the wind. I was going to try. I was going to break every rule in the book, risk my freedom, and gamble my entire future on a piece of plastic and a hunch. I turned back toward the looming dark shape of the mansion, shivering not from the cold, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had a weapon now. And tomorrow I was going to start a war against the silence. I'm Ilara Vance, 29 years old, and before I was invisible, I was the youngest lead engineer in MIT's Neural Haptics department. The morning sun sliced through the glass ceiling of the conservatory, casting long, jagged shadows across the tropical ferns that Julian Thorne paid thousands of dollars to keep alive in a climate that should have killed them. I felt like one of those plants, displaced, fragile, and surviving on borrowed time. My apron felt heavy around my waist, weighed down not by cleaning supplies, but by the illegal device burning a hole in my pocket. I had spent the last hour searching the estate for Leo. The house staff whispered that he was hiding again, that the incident last night had left him volatile and unreachable. But I knew he wasn't hiding to be difficult. He was hiding to escape the noise. I found him near the orchid wall. He was standing perfectly still, his small forehead pressed against the thick pane of glass that separated the humid conservatory from the manicured gardens outside. On the other side of the glass, a hummingbird was hovering, its wings a blur of iridescent green, tapping frantically against the invisible barrier. I stopped breathing for a second. Leo wasn't looking at the bird. His eyes were squeezed shut. His small, pale hands were splayed flat against the glass, right where the bird's beak was tapping. He was feeling the vibration. He was trying to connect with a living thing through the only language the world had left him: touch. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to bruise the inside of my chest. This was it. This was the moment that would either save him or ruin me. I took a step forward, my sneaker squeaking softly on the marble tile. Leo didn't move. He couldn't hear me, and the vibration of my footstep was likely swallowed by the heavy stone. I crept closer, the humidity of the room making my uniform stick to my back. I was shaking. My hands were trembling so violently that when I reached into my deep pocket to retrieve the sink vibe, I almost fumbled it into the dirt of a potted palm. I knelt beside him. The movement shifted the air pressure enough for him to notice. Leo's eyes snapped open, wide and filled with a defensive, animalistic panic. He scrambled back, his back hitting the glass with a dull thud. His hands coming up instantly to protect his ears, a reflex born of years of pain. Froze. I didn't speak. I didn't try to mouth words he wouldn't understand. I just stayed on my knees, lowering my head slightly to show submission, to show him I wasn't like the doctors in the white coats who poked and prodded. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I brought the sink vibe out from behind my back. He flinched. He stared at the device in my hands like it was a weapon. It was a simple band, matte charcoal, with 2 flat copper pads designed to sit on the temporal bones. To him, it must have looked like another torture device, another heavy headset that would scream static into his broken nerves. I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking fingers. I didn't try to put it on him. Instead, I pressed the power button on the side. A tiny blue light pulsed, once, twice. I held the band out in the space between us, gripping it by the bridge so the conduction pads were free. Then, I tapped my finger against the sensor in a steady, rhythmic beat. Asterisk thump thump. Thump thump. Asterisk. The device hummed. It wasn't a sound. It was a pure, kinetic pulse that visibly shook the frame of the headset. Leo stopped shrinking away. His brow furrowed. He watched the device vibrate in my hand. He looked at the blue light pulsing in time with the shake. I moved the device an inch closer. I looked him in the eye, and then I tapped the sensor again. Thump. Curiosity is a powerful thing. It's the one instinct that overrides fear in children, even broken ones. Leo's hand drifted away from his ear. He reached out, his small fingers trembling just as much as mine. He touched the copper pad. I tapped the rhythm again. The vibration zipped through his fingertips. His eyes went wide. He pulled his hand back as if burned, then immediately reached out again, pressing his palm flat against the pad. I kept the rhythm going, a steady heartbeat simulation. I watched the tension drain from his shoulders as he realized this wasn't pain. It was a pattern. It was predictable. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding. Now came the impossible part. I gently pointed to the device, then to his head. I mimed putting it on myself, tapping my own temple. Leo stiffened. The trust was fragile, thin as a spiderweb. If I moved too fast, he would scream, the guards would come, and I would be in handcuffs before noon. "Trust me," I whispered, knowing he couldn't hear the words but hoping he could read the desperation in my face. I moved my hands slowly, giving him every opportunity to push me away. He didn't. He stood frozen, his breath hitching in little gasps, watching me with an intensity that pierced right through my soul. I slid the band over his dark hair. I was meticulous. I didn't place the pads over his ears. I slid them forward, resting them squarely on the temporal bone, right at the hollow of his temples. This was the secret. This was the biology Julian's expensive doctors ignored. I needed to bypass the ear canal entirely and use the skull itself as the conductor. The fit was snug. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the high-pitched screech of feedback. But there was no screech. There was only the silence of the conservatory. I reached up and adjusted the frequency dial on the side of the band, tuning it to a low-range haptic setting. My hands were sweating. This was the test. I leaned in close, my face inches from his. I took a massive breath, filling my lungs until they ached. And then I hummed. I didn't sing a song. I hummed a low, resonant C note, a deep, chesty sound that started in my diaphragm and traveled up my throat. The sync vibe picked up the frequency of my voice. It didn't amplify the sound. It translated the pitch into a complex, nuanced vibration that traveled instantly through the copper pads, shot through Leo's temporal bone, and rattled directly into the cochlear fluid, bypassing the damaged nerves and hitting the brain's processing center. Leo's eyes flew open. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. He gasped, a sharp, wet intake of air that sounded like a sob. He didn't look at my mouth. He looked directly into my eyes. I kept humming, changing the pitch, sliding up to an E note. The vibration on his skull shifted, the texture of the sound changing in his mind. Leo raised both hands and grabbed my face. His fingers dug into my cheeks, desperate and strong. He wasn't pushing me away. He was holding me there, anchoring me in place. For 7 years, his world had been a silent movie, a series of moving images with no connection. But now, he could feel the tone of my voice resonating inside his own head. He wasn't hearing with his ears. He was hearing with his entire body. A tear leaked out of his left eye, tracking through the dirt on his cheek. He opened his mouth, his jaw working, trying to mimic the vibration he was feeling. A rough, garbled sound scratched out of his throat, imperfect, guttural, but undeniably an attempt at a tone. I stopped humming. The vibration stopped. Leo's face crumpled. He slammed his hands against the sides of the headset, pressing the pads harder against his skull, looking at me with a frantic, devastating plea. Do it again. Please do it again. I started crying. I couldn't help it. The tears blurred my vision as I nodded, smiling through the water in my eyes. I started humming again, a soft lullaby melody this time. Leo closed his eyes, his head falling forward until it rested against my chest. I wrapped my arms around him, holding the Billionaire'S broken sun on the floor of the conservatory, humming the song my mother used to sing to me, while the device I had stolen from my own past finally gave him a future. For the first time in his life, Leo Thorne wasn't alone in the dark. I'm Ilara Vance, 27 years old, and I just risked a 10-year prison sentence to put an illegal prototype on a billionaire's son's head. The vibration of my humming was still fading from the air when the reaction hit him. It wasn't the gentle, cinematic awakening I had foolishly expected. It was violent. It was terrifying. Leo gasped, his entire body jerking backward as if he had been physically struck by a bolt of lightning. His head snapped up from my chest, his movement so sudden and erratic that the matte charcoal band nearly slipped from his temples. I instinctively reached out to steady it, my heart leaping into my throat, terrified I had hurt him, terrified the frequency was too high, terrified I had just fried the brain of the most protected child in the state. "Leo," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't look at me. He looked through me. His eyes were blown wide, the pupils swallowing the irises until his eyes were dark, frantic pools of processing power. He wasn't seeing the conservatory anymore. He was seeing the sensation. He let out a noise, a sharp, involuntary yelp. Instantaneously, the sync vibe picked up the sound of his own voice. The sensors on the band translated that sharp yelp into a concussive thrum against his temporal bone. Leo froze. He stopped breathing. He had just felt his own existence. For 7 years, he had been a ghost in his own body, screaming into a void that never pushed back. But this time the void pushed back. He opened his mouth again. Ah! He pushed out, loud, unmodulated, deafening in the glass room. The band vibrated again, harder this time, matching the intensity of his volume. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His face contorted, a mask of shock so pure it looked like agony. He scrambled forward, closing the distance between us, and grabbed my wrists. His grip was shocking in its ferocity. His small fingers dug into my skin, his nails biting into the tender flesh of my forearms with a strength I didn't know a 7-year-old possessed. He was anchoring himself to the earth because his world had just tilted on its axis. Ah! Ah! Da! He screamed, the sounds raw and unformed, a keening wail that vibrated through the device and back into his own skull. I winced, tears instantly springing to my eyes, not from the pain in my wrists but from the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of what I was witnessing. He was creating a feedback loop. He was making noise just to feel the proof of his own life rattling inside his head. He shook me, his eyes locked onto mine, frantic and demanding. He screamed again, a jagged, broken sound that cracked in the middle, and then he laughed. It was the most shattered, hysterical sound I had ever heard. It was a laugh that sounded like a sob. Tears were streaming down his face now, tracking through the grime on his cheeks, dripping off his chin onto my uniform. He wasn't pulling away. He was pulling me closer, his grip tightening until my hands went numb. I saw the joy on his face, and it devastated me. It wasn't a soft, happy joy. It was sharp. It was jagged. It was the joy of a drowning man finally breaking the surface of the water and realizing that air exists. It was so intense, so raw, that it felt like a physical wound opening up in the center of my chest. I felt my own heart breaking for every single second he had lived in silence before this moment. I know, I choked out, sobbing openly now, ignoring the snot running down my face, ignoring the fact that if Julian Thorne walked in right now, my life was over. I know, Leo. Hear you. You're loud. You are so loud. He couldn't understand my words, but he felt the vibration of my voice adding to the symphony in his head. He released one of my wrists and slammed his hand against his own chest, right over his heart, thumping it in a rhythm. Thump thump. Then he pointed to his mouth. Then he pointed to the band. He understood. In less than 60 seconds, he had decoded the physics that 10 specialists had failed to teach him in a decade. He threw his head back and howled, a long, sustained note of pure liberation. The vibration must have been immense, rattling his teeth, shaking his vision, but he didn't care. He was drunk on the sensory overload. He was feasting on the chaos. I watched him, my vision blurring, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. I was witnessing a rebirth. I was watching a boy be born for the second time, right there on the dirty tile floor of a greenhouse. But then, I saw the handle of the conservatory door begin to turn. The silver lever dipped slowly. The heavy latch clicked. Leo was still screaming, lost in his new world, oblivious to the threat entering his old one. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins, instantly freezing the tears on my face. The noise. We had made too much noise. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I lunged forward, my hands shaking as I reached for the power button on the side of the headset, desperate to silence the miracle before the monster walked in. I snapped the device off. The tiny blue power light died instantly. Leo's eyes widened in betrayal, his mouth opening to scream in protest at the sudden return to silence, but I clamped my hand over his mouth, pulling his head hard into my shoulder. I shoved the charcoal headset under the thick, starched folds of my apron just as the heavy glass door swung open. It wasn't Julian. It was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, her face pinched like a dried apple. She scanned the humid conservatory, her eyes narrowing at the two of us huddled on the terracotta tiles. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, praying she wouldn't see the sweat on my upper lip or the frantic energy radiating off the boy in my arms. She just scoffed, muttered something about coddling the boy, and retreated, the latch clicking shut again. That was the first close call. It wasn't the last. For the next 14 days, I lived a double life that would have given me a stroke if I stopped to think about it. By day, I was the invisible help. I scrubbed the marble foyer until my knees bruised and swelled. I polished the mahogany banisters until they gleamed like dark water. My hands grew rough, the skin around my knuckles cracking from the harsh lemon-scented chemicals, bleeding into the rags I used to wipe down Julian's untouched library. But the moment the clock struck 2, when the staff took their break and Julian was 20 miles away in a glass tower, closing billion-dollar deals, I ceased to be a maid, became a teacher, became a lifeline. We moved our sanctuary to the music room. It was a cavernous space dominated by a Steinway grand piano that hadn't been played since Leo's mother died. I didn't dare turn the headset on during the day. The risk of the electronic hum being heard was too high. Instead, I used the instrument itself to prepare his brain for what the headset would eventually deliver. I sat Leo on top of the piano, his small legs dangling over the black lacquer. "Feel this," I whispered, though he couldn't hear the words. I took his hand and placed it flat against the smooth wood of the piano's body, right over the bass strings. I slammed my hand down on a low A chord. The piano roared. The vibration was massive, a tectonic rumble that shook the entire instrument and traveled up through his thighs. Leo gasped, his hand jerking, but he didn't pull away. He looked at me, eyes wide and dark. "B," I mouthed, exaggerating the movement of my lips. I signed the letter B. Flat hand, thumb tucked. Then I pointed to the deep, rumbling vibration under his hand. Asterisk bass. Bottom. Big. Asterisk. Then I moved his hand to the high treble side. I tickled the highest C key, a sharp, crystalline ping that vibrated fast and tight, buzzing like a mosquito against his palm. T, I mouthed. Asterisk top. Tinny. Treble. Asterisk. Leo stared at his hand. He looked at the keys. Slowly, hesitantly. He reached out and pressed the low key himself. Boom, he pressed the high key. Bing. A light switched on behind his eyes. It wasn't just noise. It was a code. He was starving. That's the only way I can describe it. He attacked the lessons with a ferocity that terrified me. We didn't just do high and low. We did the alphabet. I would tap a rhythm on his collarbone. 1 tap for A, 2 for B, while he felt the corresponding vibration on the piano. I taught him that his name, Leo, felt like a rolling chord in the middle register. I taught him that Dad felt like the heavy, ominous thud of the lowest pedal. He was a genius. I realized that within 3 days. The doctors had called him cognitively delayed. The reports Julian left on his desk claimed he was unteachable. They were wrong. They were so tragically, criminally wrong. His brain wasn't broken, it was just isolated. Now that the bridge was built, traffic was flowing at 100 miles an hour. His tantrums stopped. The violent outbursts that usually resulted in broken vases and bruised shins evaporated. Why would he scream when he could finally listen? The rage that had defined his existence was melting away, replaced by a desperate, insatiable hunger for connection. I looked at my hands one afternoon, resting on the ivory keys next to his small, pale fingers. My skin was red and raw from the morning scrubbing, the cuticles jagged and ugly. They were the hands of a servant, designed for labor and silence. But in the dim light of that music room, watching Leo press his cheek against the wood to feel the resonance of a C major scale, I knew the truth. These cracked, bleeding hands were the only thing holding him to the earth. We were conspirators in the shadows of a fortress. Julian Thorne thought he was building an empire, but right under his nose, inside his own house, I was building something far more dangerous. I was building his son. And I knew, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that when Julian finally found out what we were doing, the silence wouldn't be the only thing that shattered. I'm Clara Holloway, 29 years old, and I was about to lose the only job keeping me off the streets because I dared to give a billionaire's son his hearing back. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky hangs low and heavy like a wet wool blanket. The forecast had called for a drizzle, but what we got was a deluge. The rain wasn't just falling, it was assaulting the earth. It hammered against the glass roof of the solarium with a rhythmic, deafening intensity that would have been annoying to anyone else. But for Leo, it was a symphony. We were sitting on the floor, huddled together on a plush Persian rug I had dragged over from the sitting room. I had the sync vibe positioned carefully over his temporal bone, the contact pads humming against his skin. The device was glowing a soft, pulsing blue, indicating that the audio-to-vibration algorithm was working at maximum capacity. I watched Leo's face. His eyes were wide, darting up to the glass ceiling every time a particularly heavy sheet of water slammed against the panes. He wasn't just feeling the vibration through the floor anymore. He was hearing it inside his skull. He giggled. It was a wet, bubbly sound that started in his belly and erupted out of his mouth without any filter. He pointed a shaking finger at the ceiling, then slapped his hands against his thighs in time with the downpour. Pat, pat, pat. He was mimicking the rhythm. My heart swelled so big I thought it might crack my ribs. This was it. This was the breakthrough. He was connecting an external visual event, the rain, with the internal auditory stimulation. He was bridging the gap. "Yes, Leo," I whispered, my voice trembling. "That's the rain. It's the sky talking." He looked at me, his face glowing with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. He reached out and touched my lips, waiting for me to speak again so he could feel the difference between my voice and the storm. I smiled, tears blurring my vision. Felt like a god. I felt like I had reached into the void and pulled out a soul. I was so lost in his joy, so consumed by the miracle happening on that rug, that I forgot the one rule that governed this house. Julian Thorne sees everything. I didn't hear the tires on the gravel. The storm was too loud. I didn't hear the heavy oak front door open 3 rooms away. I didn't hear the footsteps, sharp, angry, purposeful, marching down the marble hallway. The first warning I got was the shadow. A long, dark shape fell across Leo's face, cutting off the light from the hallway. Froze. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The smile died on my lips. Slowly, terrified of what I would find, I turned my head. Julian Thorne was standing in the doorway. He was supposed to be in Tokyo. He was supposed to be closing a merger that was worth more than the GDP of a small country. He wasn't supposed to be standing 10 feet away from me. His Armani suit damp at the shoulders. His face a terrifying mask of ashen gray. He didn't look like a father coming home to his son. He looked like a man walking into a crime scene. His eyes weren't on me. They were locked on the device strapped to Leo's head. He saw the blinking blue lights. He saw the wires. He saw a maid, a nobody, crouched over his disabled son with a piece of unauthorized strange machinery attached to his skull. He didn't see a miracle. He saw a violation. "What?" he whispered, the word cutting through the room louder than the storm. "Is that thing on my son?" I scrambled to my knees, my hands shaking so hard I could barely feel the floor beneath me. "Mr. Thorne, please, I can explain." "Get away from him." The roar that came out of him was primal. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a wounded animal defending its young. He moved faster than I thought a man of his size could move. He crossed the room in 2 strides. I flinched, raising my hands to protect my face, thinking he was going to hit me. But he didn't care about me. He only cared about Leo. He dropped to his knees, his expensive suit pants hitting the dusty rug with a thud. He reached out with trembling hands. "No, wait!" I screamed, realizing what he was about to do. "Don't take it off. He's adjusting, you can't just." Julian didn't listen. Why would he listen to the help? He grabbed the sink vibe with both hands. Leo looked up at his father, his eyes confused, a smile still lingering on his lips because he thought this was part of the game. He thought his dad had come to listen to the rain too. Julian ripped the device off Leo's head. He didn't unbuckle it. He didn't loosen the strap. He tore it away with such violence that the plastic casing cracked. The result was immediate and catastrophic. 1 second, Leo was immersed in a world of sensory richness. The drumming rain, the hum of the air, the sound of his own breath. The next second, he was plunged back into the absolute, suffocating void of total silence. It must have felt like dying. Leo's mouth opened. His eyes rolled back in his head for a fraction of a second, his brain short-circuiting from the sudden sensory deprivation. And then he screamed. It wasn't the angry scream of a tantrum. It wasn't the whine of a spoiled child. It was a sound of pure, unmitigated horror. It was a high-pitched, guttural shriek that scraped against the walls and tore through my eardrums. He clawed at his ears, digging his fingernails into his skin until red welts appeared, trying to claw the silence out of his head. He thrashed backward, his head slamming against the floor, his legs kicking out wildly. "Leo!" Julian shouted, dropping the broken headset as if it had burned him. He tried to grab the boy's shoulders. "Leo, it's okay. Daddy's here. Stop it. Stop it." But Leo couldn't hear him. Leo couldn't hear anything. The monster was back. The silence had returned, and it was heavier and darker than it had ever been before because now he knew what he was missing. I watched, paralyzed by horror, as the boy I had spent weeks carefully coaxing out of his shell shattered into a million pieces right in front of us. Julian looked up at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and murderous rage. He was holding his screaming son against his chest, but Leo was fighting him, biting at his father's arm, desperate to escape the silent prison. "What did you do?" Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a deadly quiet fury. "What did you do to my boy?" I couldn't breathe. My throat had closed up. I looked at the broken device on the floor, the blue light flickering and dying. I looked at the rain still hammering against the glass, a sound that Leo could no longer hear. "I gave him the world," I whispered, tears spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. "And you just took it away." I'm Clara Holloway, 29 years old, and I was watching a billionaire look at me like I was a terrorist who had just detonated a bomb in his living room. The air in the solarium was thick enough to choke on. The only sound was Leo's ragged, gasping sobs, a noise that tore through the silence like jagged glass. He was curled into a fetal ball on the Persian rug, clutching his ears, rocking back and forth in a rhythm of pure despair. Julian stood over him, his chest heaving. In his right hand, he gripped the fractured remains of the Sync Vibe headset. He held it away from his body with a trembling arm, staring at the exposed wires and the dying blue LED light as if it were radioactive waste. "Security!" Julian roared, his voice cracking with a violence that made the glass panes rattle. "Get in here! Now!" Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. The cavalry was coming to remove the threat. The threat was me. "You're sick," Julian spat, turning his wild eyes on me. He looked deranged, his perfect hair falling over his forehead, his face flushed with a terrifying mixture of panic and fury. "You used a taser on my son? A shock collar? What kind of twisted?" "It's not a weapon," I screamed back. "Don't you speak." He took a step toward me, brandishing the broken device like a club. "You don't get to speak. You're done. You're going to jail. I'm going to bury you so deep under a lawsuit you'll never see the sun again." I looked at Leo. He was still rocking. He was retreating. Every second he spent in this sudden, traumatic silence was undoing weeks of neural pathway construction. The window of plasticity was slamming shut. Fear evaporated. The adrenaline that had been making my knees shake suddenly crystallized into something cold and sharp. I wasn't a maid anymore. I wasn't Clara Holloway, the girl who scrubbed toilets and polished silver to pay off student loans. I straightened my spine. I stopped looking at the floor. I looked Julian Thorne dead in the eye. "Give me the device," I said. My voice was low, hard, and completely devoid of the deference I had faked for 6 months. Julian blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in my tone. "Excuse me. The transducer is cracked, but the processor might be intact," I snapped, stepping toward him. "If I can resolder the connection to the temporal pad, I can get the signal back before his brain rejects the memory of the sound." "Give it to me." "Security!" he yelled again, backing away from me, shielding the device. "Get this woman out of my house." 2 large men in dark suits burst through the double doors, their hands hovering near their belts. "Grab her," Julian commanded, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "His cochlea is ossified, Julian," I said. The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. Julian froze. His hand dropped slightly. The guards hesitated, looking between their boss and the maid who was suddenly speaking like a surgeon. "What?" Julian whispered. I didn't back down. I advanced on him, reciting the data that had been burned into my brain for years. "Leo didn't respond to the $60,000 implants you bought him because his cochlear nerve displays severe hypoplasia. The auditory nerve fibers have atrophied due to lack of stimulation. You've been trying to force an electrical signal through a dead wire." Julian's face went slack. The anger was still there, but confusion was warring for dominance. "How do you know that? Those medical files are sealed." "The implants failed because they rely on the inner ear structure," I continued, my voice rising, gaining speed and confidence. "My device doesn't. The Sync Vibe uses osteoconductive resonance to bypass the cochlea entirely and stimulate the vestibulocochlear nerve directly at the brainstem level. That toy you just smashed wasn't shocking him. It was translating the barometric pressure of the rain into a C-sharp frequency that his brain could finally interpret as sound." I pointed at Leo, who was still sobbing on the floor. "He wasn't screaming because I hurt him," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He was screaming because for the first time in his life, he heard the world, and you just ripped it away from him." Silence descended on the room. Real silence. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Julian stared at me. He looked down at the broken plastic in his hand, then back at my face. He was processing what I had said, the specific medical terminology, the cadence of my speech. It was the language of his world, not the language of the help. He looked at the device again. He turned it over, seeing the custom soldered circuit board, the 3D printed casing, the handwritten serial number on the inside of the band. Proto 4. His eyes narrowed. A flicker of recognition sparked behind his iris. He had seen this tech before. He had read the white papers. He had rejected the funding proposal 3 years ago because he thought the science was too experimental, too risky. He looked up at me, really looked at me, stripping away the maid's uniform, the messy bun, the lack of makeup. He searched my features, matching them against a photo he had seen in a medical journal years ago. "You," he breathed. The color drained from his face, leaving him ghostly pale. "You vanish. Everyone said you quit. They said you had a breakdown." "I didn't have a breakdown," I said, stepping close enough to snatch the device from his slackened grip. "I ran out of funding. And I wasn't going to let my research die in a filing cabinet while boys like Leo lived in silence." "You're not Clara," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "No," I said, holding the broken pieces of his son's future in my hands. "I'm Dr. Tansy Sterling. And you just broke the only prototype in existence. I'm Tansy Sterling, 29 years old. And I am the disgraced neuroscientist who just held a Billionaire'S heart hostage with a handful of broken plastic and wires." The name hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Julian stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant mask of the billionaire tycoon completely dissolved. He looked from the shattered headset in his hands to my face, trying to reconcile the image of the woman who scrubbed his floors with the researcher whose career he had effectively ended with a single signature 3 years ago. "Sterling," he murmured, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. You were the one with the radical synthesis theory. The one they called a fraud." "Visionary," I corrected, my voice hard. "They called me a fraud because I didn't wait for the ethics board to approve my prototypes. I knew it worked. I just needed someone to listen." I took a step forward, my hand outstretched. "Give me the headset, Julian. Every second it's off his head. His brain is mapping the silence back over the auditory cortex. We are losing ground." He didn't move. He was paralyzed by the magnitude of his mistake. But Leo wasn't. On the floor, the sobbing had stopped, replaced by a frantic, animalistic desperation. Leo had seen the blue light die. He had felt the world vanish. He crawled across the Persian rug, his small knees dragging over the intricate patterns, his face wet with tears and snot. He didn't crawl to me. He crawled to his father. Leo grabbed the hem of Julian's tailored trousers. He yanked on the fabric, his small knuckles white. He pointed at the broken device in Julian's hand, then at his own ear, then back at the device. He opened his mouth and let out a sound, a hollow, rushing breath of air, trying to beg for the return of the noise. He was begging for the rain. Julian looked down. I saw the moment his heart shattered. He wasn't seeing a disability anymore. He wasn't seeing a medical file or a problem to be thrown at surgeons in Switzerland. He was seeing his son, terrified of the dark, begging him to turn the lights back on. "He wants it," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "He knows what it is. He knows it's the key," I said, moving closer, ignoring the confused security guards who were still hovering by the door. "Give it to me." Julian's hand trembled. A violent, uncontrollable shake. He looked at the device, then at me. There was no arrogance left in his eyes, only a raw, terrified plea. He carefully placed the fractured casing into my palm as if he were handing me a live grenade. "Fix it," he choked out. "Please. Just fix it." I dropped to my knees right there on the rug. I didn't have my tools. I didn't have my soldering iron or my microcalipers. I had fingernails and desperation. I examined the damage. The casing was cracked down the center, severing the connection between the battery unit and the haptic transducer. The processor was intact, thank God, but the circuit was open. "Come here, Leo," I signed, my hands moving automatically. Leo flinched, his eyes darting between me and the device. He recognized the blue plastic. He scrambled toward me, thrusting his head forward, offering himself up to the machine. I pressed the two halves of the casing together with my thumbs, using brute force to bridge the connection. My fingers screamed in protest as the sharp plastic dug into my skin, but I squeezed harder. Blick. The tiny blue LED flickered. It went dark, then sputtered, then held a steady, solid azure glow. Gasp. "Hold still, Leo." I slid the band over his head, positioning the conduction pads directly behind his ears, right over the mastoid bone. I kept my thumbs pressed hard against the brake, my own hands becoming the clamp that held his world together. I nodded at Julian. "Speak." Julian froze. "What?" "Say something," I commanded, my voice fierce. "He needs a reference point. Speak to him." Julian dropped to his knees in front of us. He was level with his son now. He looked terrified. He took a breath, his chest hitching. "Leo," he whispered. Leo's eyes widened. His head snapped up. The vibration of his father's voice had traveled through the device, through his skull, and ignited the auditory nerve. He didn't hear it with his ears. He heard it inside his mind. Leo reached out. His small, trembling hand touched Julian's throat. He felt the rumble there, matching the sensation in his own head. I watched the synapses firing behind the boy's eyes. I saw the connection click into place. The lesson from this morning. The vibration. The mimicry. Leo took a deep, ragged breath. He looked Julian dead in the eye. He focused with an intensity that made him look decades older than 5. He pressed his hand against his own throat, just like I had taught him. He frowned, concentrating on the muscle memory. "Pa!" The sound was wet, guttural, and unformed, but it was a syllable. Julian stopped breathing. He went completely still, tears spilling over his lower lashes. Leo frowned deeper, frustrated. He adjusted the pitch, feeling the buzz of the device against my thumbs. He tried again, louder this time, pushing the air past his vocal cords with intent. "Papa." It was croaky. It was unpracticed. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Julian let out a sound that wasn't a word. It was a sob that seemed to rip his chest open. He didn't just cry, he collapsed. He fell forward, wrapping his arms around his son, burying his face in the crook of Leo's small neck. "I heard you," Julian sobbed, his voice muffled by Leo's shirt. "I heard you, Leo. I heard you." Leo didn't pull away. For the first time, he didn't recoil from his father's touch. He patted Julian's hair, awkward and hesitant, his eyes wide with wonder as he listened to the sound of his father's weeping vibrating through his skull. I stayed there, my thumbs turning white from the pressure of holding the device together, my own tears dripping silently onto the expensive Persian rug. I was the architect of this miracle, but I was also a prisoner of it. As long as I held this plastic together, they were connected. If I let go, the silence returned. Julian lifted his head, his face red and wet, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no anger left, no suspicion, just a terrifying, overwhelming gratitude. "Don't let go," he whispered to me, terrified. "I won't," I promised, my arms beginning to ache. "I've got him." I'm Dr. Tansy Sterling, 29 years old, and 6 months ago I was a fugitive in a maid's uniform scrubbing floors to survive. Today, I am the executive director of the Thorne Sterling Auditory Institute, and I have just revolutionized the way the world hears. I stood behind the floor-to-ceiling glass of my office, a space that used to be the gloomy, unused East Wing ballroom of the Thorne estate. The dust and draped furniture were gone, replaced by rows of gleaming servers, 3D printers, and a team of 12 hand-picked neuroengineers who answer to me. The air no longer smelled of lemon pledge and stale despair. It smelled of ozone and hot coffee. I adjusted the collar of my silk blouse, my fingers brushing against the security badge clipped to my lapel. It still felt surreal to see my real name printed there in bold, black letters. Dr. Tansy Sterling. Below me, on the sprawling green lawn where I used to drag trash bags in the rain, a miracle was taking place. Julian was running. The man who used to march through these halls like a storm cloud, terrified of his own son's silence, was sprinting across the grass in a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't barking orders at an assistant. He was laughing. And running ahead of him was Leo. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, my heart swelling painfully in my chest. Leo wasn't stumbling. He wasn't looking over his shoulder with that heartbreaking feral panic he used to have when the world surprised him. He was charging forward, his small legs pumping, chasing a frisbee that Julian had just tossed. Clamped securely around Leo's head was the TIS-1. Didn't look like a medical device anymore. It didn't look like the fragile, taped-together mess of plastic I had held together with my trembling thumbs on the rug 6 months ago. The new iteration was sleek, matte black, and aerodynamic. It looked like a high-end sports band. It was water-resistant, shock-proof, and powered by a kinetic battery that charged as he moved. But the real magic was inside. My code was running through that band, bypassing his damaged cochlea entirely and streaming the world directly into his auditory cortex. Leo lunged for the frisbee, missed, and tumbled onto the grass. I held my breath. 6 months ago, a fall like that would have resulted in a silent scream and hours of rocking in a dark corner. Instead, I heard it. Even through the double-paned glass of my office, I heard it. Leo giggled. It was a bright, bubbling sound, uninhibited and loud. He rolled onto his back, pointing at the sky, shouting something at his father. It wasn't perfect speech. His vowels were still rounding out, his consonants still finding their sharp edges, but it was language. "High. Too high, Papa." Julian collapsed onto the grass beside him, breathless. He didn't pull Leo up immediately. He just lay there next to his son, staring up at the clouds, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees and knowing, for the first time in 5 years, that his son was listening to the exact same wind. They were sharing the world. A knock at my door broke my trance. I turned to see my lead engineer, Marcus, holding a tablet. "Dr. Sterling," he said, his voice respectful. "The patent filings for the Asian markets are ready for your signature. And the board is asking if we can move up the press conference for the public release." "Tell them to wait," I said, my voice steady and authoritative. "We don't release until the latency is under 4 milliseconds. I won't sell a product that lags behind reality. Not for anyone." Marcus nodded, scribbling a note. "Understood." "Oh, and Mr. Thorne transferred the second tranche of the endowment. The funds are in." "Thank you, Marcus." He left, closing the door softly. I looked back out the window. Julian had sat up. He was brushing grass off Leo's shoulder. Then he stopped. He looked up at the house. He knew exactly where my office was. Our eyes met across the distance. He couldn't see me clearly through the glare of the glass, but I knew he could feel me watching. The dynamic between us had shifted tectonically. The day I held that broken prototype together on the rug, screaming at him to speak to his son, the power balance had shattered. I wasn't his employee anymore. I wasn't the help. I was the only person on earth who understood the architecture of his son's mind. He didn't wave. He just nodded. It was a solemn, intense nod. It was an acknowledgement of the debt he could never repay, despite the millions he was pouring into my bank account. He had offered me a salary that made my knees weak. He had offered me equity. He had offered me the world. But looking at him now, seeing the way his hand rested protectively on Leo's head, I knew the money was just the logistics. The real payment was the noise. I walked over to my desk and sat down. I opened the bottom drawer, bypassing the stacks of legal documents and blueprints. I reached to the very back and pulled out a small, jagged piece of blue plastic. It was a fragment of the original prototype. The one Julian had smashed. The one I had resurrected with nothing but willpower and fingernails. I ran my thumb over the sharp edge. It was a reminder. I had come to this house a ghost. I was hiding from my failures, hiding from a scientific community that called me crazy, hiding from a life that had chewed me up and spit me out. I thought I had taken this job to survive. I thought I was scrubbing floors to disappear. But silence is a funny thing. It forces you to listen to the things you're trying to ignore. I didn't just fix Leo's hearing. In the process of fighting for his right to be part of the world, I had fought for my own. I wasn't the maid anymore. I wasn't the fraud. I was the woman who turned the lights back on. I put the plastic back in the drawer and closed it with a solid, satisfying click. I pulled up the schematics for the TS2 on my monitor. There was work to do. Leo was going to start school in the fall, and I needed to design a noise filtering algorithm that could handle a chaotic classroom. I smiled, the cursor blinking on the screen like a heartbeat. I came here to give a little boy his voice, but in the end, I was the one who finally found mine.